I'm also going to warn you that we're going to have to take questions at the end because I am, those of you who know me, I'm very chatty. So if you give me a good question, I could riff on it for like 10 or 15 minutes, and then we wouldn't get to the rest of the talk. So I'm going to try to make sure that as I'm doing the talk that we get through all the key pieces of information that we need, and then hopefully, I've been told I can go right until 5, so hopefully there'll be time at the end where we can consolidate and discuss and talk about things in more detail. But if I say something that's dumb or unclear or contradictory, you can stop me and say, hey, Ann, that didn't make any sense. I'm good with that. So, okay, so my slide here, my first, let's see, where did I put here's my forward thing. Okay, so you've got, oh, good. Okay, you've seen this disclaimer already, I think, at other talks. And I have nothing to disclose. And here we are. This is the first Southern Idaho affiliate walk. I'm carrying the banner. You can see my hair's grown a little since then. So decisions about reproduction are very personal. And I've been working with families making reproductive decisions most of my life. I'm a licensed genetic counselor. And I have learned that each family is different. Families continue to surprise me and to teach me new things. I also know that choices are complicated, they're deeply personal, and they're affected by so many different factors. And there is not one right answer. Even within a family or a couple, there can be disagreements about what their values and expectations are. Before we talk about reproductive options and reproductive decision makings, there are a couple things that I want to share with you. These are things that I have learned in my 33 years as a genetic counselor. I know, I don't even look 33, right? I went to kindergarten and then I became a genetic counselor. And my 58 years as a human being. There are things that I try to keep in mind in all of my interactions, but are especially important when working with families that are affected with a genetic condition. The first is that even while we're talking about family planning and looking at ways to potentially avoid passing along a gene for Huntington's disease to a child, I think it's important to recognize the value of the people with Huntington's disease in our lives. I know that as someone who has worked with people with Huntington's for almost 30 years now, that some of my absolute favorite people in my life have Huntington's disease or are living at risk for HD. And there are two of them. So people who came to my very first support group couple decades ago. So the challenges that HD families experience can be hard and painful. It is a tough, tough disease. But I think that this adversity also creates something special, some insight, humor, wisdom, and compassion that I don't necessarily run into in other areas of my life. Human beings were never meant to be perfect. I don't even know what perfect is, right? We all have things about us that make us vulnerable and scared and need each other, and that's part of what it is to be human. When I meet with families to discuss reproductive options, I want to make sure that they do make the best decision for their family. And I also want the people with HD in my life to know how much that I care about them and how much I value them. As I said, some of my favorite people in the world have HD. Second, as I hope to convey to you in this slide, families come in all different shapes and sizes, and you get to define what family is to you and what you want your family to look like. So as a genetic counselor, my job is to help families know what their options are and to appreciate the upsides and downsides of each option. Once families understand the options, I try to help them work together to make a decision that is most consistent with their values and their family goals. These are very personal decisions, and it's normal for different families to choose different parenting paths. Again, there is not one right thing to do. It's also normal for prospective parents to not completely agree on their family goals. We don't choose a spouse because they're exactly like us. That would be so very boring, wouldn't it? If you were just married to someone who said, yes, dear, yes, dear, yes, dear, all the time, and you never disagreed on anything. That's not what you want. That's not what you want. Let's see. So, in the family planning situations that I'll be discussing, I'm imagining a family in which one of the parents or prospective parents is not showing symptoms and has either tested positive for HD or is living at a 50% risk. That is, they have a parent who is positive for the HD gene. So next, we're going to get a really quick overview of genetics. So starting at the very basics of genes. Genes are sets of instructions that tell the body how to make proteins, which in turn allow the body to grow and to develop and function on a daily basis. We all have about 20,000 genes. And I always think it's really important to stop into this. Could you have 20,000 of anything and have them all be perfect? So none of us has a perfect set of 20,000 genes, right? We all are carrying something. We're all carrying more than one thing. There are multiple genetic diseases that each one of us could be susceptible for. These are proteins that, again, help us to grow and develop. Huntington's disease is caused by just one of these genes. When it's working normally, there's no problem, of course, but when there's a change in it, a person will eventually get HD if they live long enough. The version of the gene that causes HD, I just call it the gene for HD. So what I'll usually say is that the normal gene or the typical gene and the gene for HD. And we could talk for a long time about how that gene works and all kinds of cool and interesting things that the HD gene does, but we're not going to. I'm just going to keep it simple. It's either going to be the normal copy of the gene or the gene for HD as we're going forward. And a quick review of the inheritance for HD, which is, we call it autosomal dominant inheritance. And just a quick refresher on that, I bet a lot of you already know this, but if you look at this slide, the man on the left has two blue copies of the HD gene, let's say, and in this case, those are the two normal functioning copies. And then on the right side, the mom has a blue copy, which is normal, and then the pink copy is the gene for HD. And then every time that the man makes sperm cells, he'll always pass on the normal copy, because that's all he has to pass on. Whereas every time the mom makes the egg cells, half the time she'll pass on her normal copy of the gene, and then the other half the time she'll pass on the gene for HD. And so you can see in the children, there are 2 boys and 2 girls, and the 2 of them are unaffected, and then 2 of them are affected. And this, of course, is the sort of generic version of it. It's like flipping a coin for the mom when she makes the egg cells here. It's not going to be one has HD, The next one's normal, the next one has HD, the next one's normal. It's like flipping a coin. You can flip a coin and get 10 heads in a row, right? So each event is independent of what's happened before. And so this might be what a family history looks like, where you see the parents, the mom there is the black circle with the 1 in front of it, and then the husband is the 2 without HD. And then when they have kids, number 6, 7, 8, and 9 there are their children, and you see in this case 3/4 of them ended up inheriting the gene. And then 2 who inherited the gene went on to have kids, and in their case they passed on as 50-50. So this is just an example of what that looks like. This is the background you need before we can move into the next piece. So let's consider a hypothetical couple in which one person is gene positive or living at risk for HD. And this couple is just starting to think about having children. If they come to me as a genetic counselor and they want to know all of their options, this is basically the whole menu. These are the options that are available to them. And I'm going to go into each one of these in a bit more detail, but I think it's helpful to start from just looking at this is the whole menu. This is where we're going to be going. So basically, the choices are to have kids without intervention or testing, and you can do that. You can just say, you know what, we want to have kids, we're going to have kids. And then I also know, because I worked in reproduction my whole life, sometimes kids just happen, and you didn't plan them, and that's okay too. But there's nothing wrong if you're at risk for a HD or you've tested positive and you want to have kids. You should be able to have kids. And if you don't want to go through any of the testing, that's fine. You can also decide to not have children and to take measures such as a vasectomy or a tubal ligation, or a very reliable birth control method to make sure that there are no surprises. Again, I've worked in reproductive health care most of my adult life, and I've seen a lot of surprises. So if you really don't want to have children, it's important to make sure that you take the appropriate measures. You can decide to have a family, but have a family that is not biologically related, such as becoming foster parents or adopting a child. You can not make a decision at all and see what happens. You can decide to have children and then take steps to make sure that the child does not have the Huntington's disease gene. And there are several ways to achieve that. They are pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, donor egg and donor sperm or embryo adoption, prenatal diagnosis, and this is a little tricky, and we'll talk about it later. And there are 2 approaches to prenatal diagnosis. CVS, which is short for chorionic villus sampling, and amniocentesis. And I'm going to go into more detail on each of these in a moment. But first I want to back up and talk about how decisions are made. It's really important to think seriously about what you want, and then to have thoughtful conversations about what matters to each of you. The conversations obviously should include both members of the couple and might also include extended family and friends. Each family is different, and families come in many different forms. Partners can have different values, different religious beliefs, different life goals, different past experiences, different fears, and different hopes for their own lives and their families. So take time to listen, to reflect, and to discuss, and to think. At the end of my talk, I'm going to offer several specific questions to help guide you as you're having some of these conversations. Now we'll go back and go into a little more detail on the big list of options. So some families like to keep things simple, and that's okay. There are a lot of advantages to these approaches which don't require much technology and are easy to understand. So as I said earlier, you can just decide to have kids. Just say, it's fine, and we'll accept whatever child comes. You can decide not to have children and then take these measures to make sure that you don't accidentally have a child. You can decide to have a family that's not biologically related, or you can not decide and see what happens. And I include that last one because I think that sometimes we get so caught up in the planning. We get so caught up in the overthinking. We get so caught up in trying to do the right thing that it takes a toll on the couple. That they forget why they fell in love. They forget about the things that they do that they enjoy together. They forget the fun, and they're just like, okay, well, can we afford to do this? Can we afford to do that? Well, what would happen if, what would happen to this? And that as you do that, it really can undermine your relationship. And so sometimes just saying we're not going to decide, or we're going to put this aside for a while, because the stress, anxiety, and possible conflict that comes up around these topics can create significant tension within a family. Taking some of the pressure off your relationship by deciding to not decide can actually be healthy. Looking at these options as a group, we can see that there's some great aspects of these options as well as some drawbacks. On the good side, they're all not very expensive. They're pretty easy to understand, and they're medically uncomplicated. On the downside, going one of these routes may be a tough decision to make. And having a child without intervention can create a sense of uncertainty about whether or not the child has inherited the gene. And for some families, this may cause anxiety, stress, and a sense of guilt. What have we done? You know, what might we have burdened our child with if we've passed this gene to them? And so knowing kind of where your tendencies toward anxiety lie and what kinds of things you worry about can be helpful as you make the decision, is just kind of noticing your own thought process and how you think and what you worry about and what you're anxious about. For families that choose to have non-biologic children, for example, foster parenting or adoption, these may be legally and socially complicated and can create their own sense of uncertainty. Thinking about how you cope with uncertainty in your life, in other areas of your life, is an important piece in making these decisions. So we made it this far, so give yourself a high five. This is me several years ago with Sarah Weber, the current president of the Southern Idaho affiliate. But you can see how long ago it was because look at my hair. It was a few years ago. Let's see. So next, let's talk about some of the high-tech options. These options will allow a couple to have a child that they know has not inherited the HD gene. And so let's look at that list. So one possibility is to become pregnant, but through gamete or embryo adoption, donor gametes or embryo adoption. So basically using a donor egg or sperm. And the word gamete, I don't know how widely it's used outside of reproductive circles, but gamete is just a generic term for eggs and sperm together, so gamete donation. Gamete donation uses the egg or sperm of a donor who is not at risk for having Huntington's disease to replace the egg or sperm for the gene positive or at-risk parent, and the biologic egg or sperm from the parent without the HD family history. A related kind of donation is an embryo adoption. Embryo adoption uses a healthy embryo from another family who underwent in vitro fertilization, or IVF, and had unused healthy embryos left over after they completed their pregnancies. Does that make sense? So the procedures of using donor egg or adopting an embryo require the support of a fertility specialist to make sure that the mother's body is prepared to receive and support the developing embryo. I don't know if are people here familiar or know anybody who's been through IVF? And it's a pretty significant commitment on the mom's part. It's not easy biologically to be put through what the fertility doctors put women through to be able to basically just reprogram their cycles to make it ready to receive that embryo. So it's something that, it sounds maybe easy on paper, but from what I've heard, I'm seeing nods, it's hard. And it may be worth it if it means a lot to a person to be able to carry that pregnancy. I think it can be worth it, but it's not worth it to everybody, and so it's something to think about. How much do you like having your body? Are you willing to have your body messed with to be able to do this? The pros of the gamete adoption, or gamete donation and embryo adoption, is that the mother is able to carry the pregnancy and to experience the bonding throughout gestation. And certainly that I think a lot of moms, a lot of women really want that experience of being pregnant. And I think that's important to validate that. I think some moms feel like if they haven't carried a pregnancy that they may not be really moms. And while I don't think it's true, in a logical way, I certainly understand that experience of wanting that full mom experience. And so, again, something to just be keeping in mind. In the case of gamete donation, one parent is biologically related to the baby. And if everything goes as it's supposed to, the baby will not be affected by HD, and you can know that going into that experience. On the downside, using gamete donation, it's possible that the parent who's not biologically related may feel like less of a parent. And I've also, as we've talked about, we know that it can be not just emotionally challenging, but physically challenging to go through some of this. It can also be very expensive, and insurance may or may not cover the procedures. And there are no guarantees that a viable pregnancy will occur. So you can go through all this, spend all your budget, and still not have a pregnancy at the end. And so that can be very anxiety-provoking as well. Okay. Yes. And a break. Deep breath. Thinking about all those needles, the idea of what women go through for in vitro. I needed a little break to look at a river. So next, let's talk about prenatal testing. So this is chorionic villus sampling or amniocentesis. In this case, the pregnancy is conceived naturally, And then prenatal testing is done on the developing embryo or fetus to see if it's inherited the gene for HD, or if the at-risk parent has chosen to not get tested, they can look for a marker from the HD positive grandparent. So CVS is done between 10 and 12 weeks, and amniocentesis is done between 14 and 18 weeks. And these numbers vary a little bit depending on the clinic that you're working with and the comfort of the maternal fetal medicine doctors who are doing the procedures and how often they do them. Results will typically take a couple weeks to get back. And one of the things that's really tricky about this is that I think I've said in some of these places, I was never quite sure how to say this. So basically the expectation is that if you do this, you will terminate a pregnancy if it's positive. And the reason for this is because if you find out that the fetus has inherited the HD gene, then you have essentially done pre-symptomatic testing on that individual. So if you terminate the pregnancy, that's fine. But if you continue the pregnancy, knowing that that baby has 45 repeats, the baby comes into the world already having been tested. The parents have this information, have the burden of knowing this information about their child as they're growing up, have to decide, who do we tell? Right? When they first got the results back and they're making the decision, did they tell their parents? Did they tell their siblings? Did they tell their best friend? And then they decide to not terminate. They continue the pregnancy. People in the world know this child's status from childhood, and the child never has the option to decide for themselves whether or not to be tested. And the parents have this burden of this information, and perhaps other people around them, if the parents talked about it while they were making the decision, are also familiar with this child's status. And it feels, I'm seeing grimaces as I look around, right? It's a very awkward situation for a family to be in. So clinics will say, if you do this, you have to terminate the pregnancy if it's positive. But can you really say that? And I think it's easy to say it when you're in the process of getting, you want a baby, you don't want them to have HD, but now you're in the second trimester, you've gotten the results back, maybe you felt the baby move already, and you say, you know what, I don't think I can terminate. But I also know they have 45 repeats. And so you're in a bit of a dilemma. And I think it's very easy in theory before you're actually carrying the baby. And then once you're actually carrying the baby, you say, well, maybe they're not even going to get symptoms until they're 40. Or maybe there'll be a cure by then. So maybe not. Okay, I wasn't going to take questions till the end, but I see Nicole's looking. Yeah. Right. Yes. Yeah. 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 So I can speak to it in that it's a moving target, and that I'm in Idaho right now, and our rules aren't even clear, and certainly we've lost a third of our OBGYNs. Out of Idaho because the rules are so unclear that they don't want to risk it. And so, yes, being aware of what the rules in your state are, because if I'm saying, well, see, we don't want to do this unless you say you're going to terminate, but legally you can't terminate unless you go to another state, but, do you have to do all the procedures in the state? And again, it's not, I was just talking to my own doctor. We were having a chat when I went in for my annual exam, and he said, And he said, oh, I don't think the law really applies to the kinds of things that I'd be doing, so I'm not worried about it. And I'm like, I love you, you're a Republican, you're my neighbor, you know all the legislators. They might not, actually. You might be okay, but you might not. I don't know, but I'm glad that you're still, I'm glad we didn't lose him. But my point is, it's all very up in the air. And so, yeah, what if I say, okay, we can do this, you have to terminate, but it's illegal to terminate?
Well, not to go down a slippery slope,
Okay.
there's even the nuance of the laws. So, for example, like, I'm in North Carolina, and there's this whole thing now that, like, after 12 weeks, it's not an option anymore.
Right.
They're talking about, so it's even about the gestation too. So you have the ambulance.
Right.
There could be fewer and fewer cases.
Yes.
where that's an
Yes.
option. And I think that even that it's not a medically not deemed a medically
Right.
necessary termination.
Right. So,
Even for
so
someone. Is that within your purview as a genetic counselor to have these
yeah, I totally can have these conversations. For me, what's really scary is that it's not settled law. And I think a lot of the doctors that are working in various places are not confident. So I have this, my one doctor, the one I was talking to, he seems pretty confident there are a lot of things he can do, even though he's in Idaho. But his colleagues don't think that, right? That's how confusing it is right now. It could be. Yeah, I think it's also that he's like 65 years old and he knows everybody. He's like, all the lawyers, all the judges, all the legislators in Idaho, I delivered all their babies. So, right. It's not, so I think in some cases, this is, I don't want to totally derail this because I could go on forever on this topic. I think you have to know what the laws of your state are as best you can. You need to ask the places that you're going to be potentially working with if you do this and say, what is your comfort level? Like, if we got this as a positive, would you help me have a second trimester termination? And if not, maybe we need to relocate to a state, and then you add a huge cost. But there are states where it still is possible, but that might be an additional stressor and cost to be able to do this. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So in this case, one uses in vitro fertilization to create fertilized eggs, which grow into embryos in the laboratory. And then the developing embryo that has grown in the lab, the developing embryos that were grown in the lab are tested for the HD gene. And you can see on the right here, a tiny needle removing a single cell from a developing embryo. They take that cell, do the genetic testing on it, and then replace the HD negative, normally developing viable embryos into the mom's uterus to grow and to develop. So when this works, the child is biologically related to both parents, and the parents can also feel confident that the child has not inherited the HD gene. It is expensive. Not sure if insurance would cover this or not. There are no guarantees that it would be successful. And I've heard stories of families that have been through 2 or 3 or 4 rounds of this, have used up the money that they had set aside for it, don't have a baby, and are back at square one. So that can happen. As a result of all this, it's stressful, both emotionally and physically. And again, it may require, because you're basically going to end up eliminating half the embryos, because half of them will have inherited the HD gene. So you have fewer embryos to work with each cycle, and that reduces the odds each time that you would have a viable embryo to replace. Time for another stress break. So this is me in my Team Hope Walk shirt with a giant blue bunny at the Down Syndrome Buddy Walk in Yokohama, Japan. So I'm wearing, actually the HD Society of Japan has a whole bunch of Team Hope Walk shirts, because every time I travel there to Japan, I take a suitcase of Team Hope Walk shirts for my Japanese genetic counselors. So as you're looking at the bunny, you might also be beginning to wonder, how do families decide what to do? And I think the best way to decide is to step back and look at some of the bigger questions. These are questions about your personal life, your goals, your values, your hopes, and your fears. And these are obviously going to be different for each family, and are worth reflecting on and chatting over with the people you trust. And I think it's also, as I mentioned earlier, it would be really boring if couples all agreed with each other on everything. But it also means that you might be in a relationship with somebody you love very dearly, who doesn't see eye to eye with you on what the path forward should be. And so these can be very difficult conversations. And it's not a matter of who's right and who's wrong. It's a matter of trying to develop the family that you want to have, given the very real and challenging circumstances that you are in. Okay. Bye, bunny. So back to big questions. So it's a matter of stepping back and asking yourself, what does family mean to us? What does it mean to have a family? What does it mean to be a family? Thinking about how important it is to have biologic children. Thinking about and paying attention how much you worry about passing on the HD gene to a child. And if so, how much? And remember also that every parent worries. Right? No matter how perfect your child is, you will, as a parent, find something to worry about. I think it's just part of the job description, because we love our children so much and we want everything to be perfect for them. And also because I only have one child, but I can say with confidence that children are just full of surprises. And you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into when you give birth. So it's just part of the experience of parenting in general is uncertainty and anxiety. But certainly HD does not make it easier. And then thinking about how many children would you as a couple want to, what feels like a complete family to you? Is it one kid? Is it 5 kids? To think about that. And then also thinking about other ways of fulfilling your desire to have a family besides just having biologic children. So some people are really satisfied being fabulous aunts and uncles. Some people just love adopting all the neighbor kids. You know, there are lots of creative ways to nurture children. And there are lots of children in the world that need nurturing, that aren't getting it. And so if you feel like, hey, you know, our goals include the nurturing piece, and maybe we don't need to be biologically related. Maybe there are other ways to do that. But again, that's something you have to figure out for yourself. So next is thinking about the long-term issues. So what are your current and future caregiving responsibilities for people in your family with HD? What are your other responsibilities in your life? Your life is not just HD. So what are your other responsibilities? Basically, overall, what kind of bandwidth do you have to take on these extra responsibilities? Have you planned for support in case the at-risk or gene-positive parent starts to develop symptoms while the children are still at home? What financial, emotional, and logistic resources do you have to draw on? And just overall, realistically, as a family, what can you afford in terms of money, time, and energy? And then the big questions, the ethics and the religious and legal perspectives. So, when you think about what you believe, what do you think about reproductive technology? What do you think about pregnancy termination? When do you think a developing life becomes sacred? How do you feel about abortion or creating and then possibly destroying embryos when using pre-implantation genetic diagnosis? And again, as we already went into, what are the laws? What's legally available to you in your state? Financially, what's the cost of reproductive technologies? What's the cost of raising children in general, not just with the technologies, but kids are expensive. Potential future costs associated with an affected parent or other family member developing HD. Would these be a burden to you or your family and affect your ability to provide for a child the way that you had hoped? And are there financial tools that you can set up now to help you or other family members in the future? So every family is different, and these are big decisions, and different people may have different feelings and beliefs and opinions, and it's okay to take a while to make this decision. Do some research, get the perspective of people whose opinions you respect. These might be friends, family, clergy, medical professionals, counselors, genetic counselors, people in the support group. Listen sympathetically to each other's perspectives as you talk this through. Be honest and thoughtful, and then try to make the best choice for your family. I have a couple other things that I want to that I quickly want to mention before we have a few minutes for questions. But I think one of the things to understand genetically about the HD gene is that even if everybody who was at risk right now for having a child with HD did not have children, like if just an entire generation of everybody at risk for having a child with HD did not have children, it would not eliminate HD because the nature of this gene is instability. So within a couple generations, that gene in somebody who had it in an intermediate range, in some individuals, it would have already expanded into that expanded range and cause HD. So you do not have a moral, if you are HD positive, you do not have any kind of moral responsibility to not have kids. So I think some people have sometimes said, well, if everybody with X disease just didn't have kids, then we would eliminate it. First of all, that just shouldn't be on you. I don't think that's a heavy responsibility. But also biologically, genetically, scientifically, it doesn't even make sense. So you don't have that responsibility. You might be able to end it within your family, but you will not end it within the population. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that everyone gets sick. Every one of us is going to get sick. Every one of us is going to die. Everybody here is probably going to need somebody to take care of them at some point or another. HD is a more complicated version of that, but it's still in the range of what human beings deal with. Human beings deal with each other being sick, and that's normal. So As a genetic counselor, again, I want to go back to some of my favorite people in the world have HD. Some of my favorite people in the world have genetic diseases. I'm not sure I want to live in a world where we're all perfect. I think it would be kind of dull. And I think sometimes it's our imperfections that teach us wisdom. It's our imperfections that teach us empathy. It's our imperfections that teach us compassion. And just don't feel like you have a responsibility to stop this gene. If you don't want to have a child with HD, that's one thing, but it's not, you don't have to take on the world. You just need to make this decision for your family. So I've gone to, I think I was told I could go right up to 5, so that gives us 10 minutes for questions, yeah. Yes.
I wanted to go back to the genetic question, the statement you just made, just to make sure I was following. So say, hypothetically, I am not positive, but I have family members that are, right? Let's say my brother or my dad. And if I reproduce, or my future generations ahead of me in my line are not at risk?
Right, yep, so
it won't like skip a generation.
it doesn't
or
skip a generation,
3.
so it's an expansion of this genetic, so genes provide their instructions in, if you think of it as words, and all the words are 3 letters long, and the word that is in the instructions in the HT gene is CAG. Is a CAG, and there are a certain number of CAG repeats that are normal and stable. And when you look at all species together, the most evolved species, the most complex species have the longest CAG repeats. So yeasts have very short CAG repeats, and then mammals have longer, and humans are longer. So we think it does something good. We think that the repeats up to a point are somehow helpful to us as a species. So longer is better until it isn't. And then when it isn't, it very dramatically isn't. So you have this long stretch of CAG, 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 and somewhere where it reaches a certain length, it becomes especially unstable when it copies itself, and it gets longer or shorter when it gets copied. And so, I forgot the question. Yeah, intermediate alleles, yeah. So, but even the non-intermediate alleles, given human mutation, so the normal ones will repeat and will eventually over generations expand into intermediates. And it was, no, we'd be looking.
Or their children, or
I mean, if it's in a high intermediate range, then yes, potentially.
okay,
But if it's in the negative range,
not likely.
No, you'd be talking hundreds of generations, thousands of generations. So it's not an issue to think about really you could stop it in your family, but we can't stop it as a population.
Right. That's what. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for making me clarify that.
So basically you're saying it would stop, but then there are people out there who have, say, like 29 repeats who are asymptomatic, have no idea, and those would be the ones that would carry on.
Yeah. I mean, if
Huntington's
we're talking,
crop up again.
thousands of years, whatever, any of them could have.
It's
And
baked
I
into
think
the
my
human
point
genome.
is, we do not have a responsibility to stop the gene for the benefit of future populations, because it's not eliminatable on a population level. So basically I'm trying to free you up to say you don't have to carry the weight of the world and the weight of the future. It's hard enough to make a decision for your own family without having to feel like, and also maybe for the benefit of all future people, maybe we could eliminate this disease. Because I've heard people say that sometimes. Well, if you don't have kids, if nobody like you has kids, then we can eliminate this disease. And first of all, I think that's cruel. But second of all, it just doesn't even make biologic sense.
Could you speak about PGD if one of the couple, one of the parents, future parents, does not want to know their own status? And so how that process works of not disclosing
Right.
while going through that process?
So I've never been part of it, so I might miss some of the details. But I mean, the key part is to look at the affected grandparent if they're available. That's the easiest. And to be able to look for genetic markers that are next to the HD gene, that are like little landmarks that are kind of unique to them, and that they can track that chromosome 4, which chromosome 4 is gone to each one of the embryos.
Right, but not revealing to the future parents.
Right.
Like the process that they don't, oops, and tell them.
Yeah, but so if you say it's, it's the mom's mom who has it, then what you're looking for is which chromosome 4, basically, which of the mom's chromosome 4s did they get? The one from the mom or the one from the dad? So you're getting the mom's one or the mom's dad's one. So you would be able to track it that way. One of the downsides of that is that basically everyone that gets the mom's chromosome 4, all those embryos would all be eliminated.
When you said that the CAGs can repeat even if you're negative, so does that mean a family that has never had Huntington's, if their CAGs are in a normal range, eventually generations and generations later, it could just one generation appear in their family?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not super common. I mean, it takes whole populations over hundreds of years to be able to see the phenomenon. But yes. I mean, we humans. It's not going to come just like totally. I mean, it could, yeah, but it, yeah. For some, yeah. Yeah, somebody could have a 34, and a 34 repeat, 35 repeat, die at, 55 without symptoms. Nobody would know. But they could have passed it, that 34 might have expanded to a 36. And, yeah. So we do see it. We see it expanding. I've seen it where there's no evidence that anybody in the family has had it before. Often, again, because it tends to expand relatively slowly, especially in those smaller ranges, it's usually a later onset.
That makes me think like maybe more people are walking around that are undiagnosed and don't know it.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody starts to show symptoms at 75 or 80, how many different kinds of dementia are there that you say, oh, his guy's Alzheimer's, or he's just getting forgetful, or, yeah, I don't know, he just gets angry really easily, but I don't know what's going on. It wasn't really like him, but, I guess, yeah, I think a lot of the later onset HD, we don't necessarily get picked up because lots of things happen to our brain at that age, and it can take a while to get enough symptoms together to have us say, hey, well, maybe we should go to the neurologist and really get this checked out.
And I don't know if folks in the room know about that there's a family planning virtual support group on the website, on HDSA's website. And so from what I hear, because I've kind of referred folks to it, it's really great because folks that have gone through experiences of making these decisions, and Lisa Mooney is the social worker who facilitates it, and she's awesome. So it's just another option to get support, to get more information, because it's a big decision. It's a big decision. Thank you.
think we have time for one more question. Any other questions? I will say our HDSA.org website has a lot of information on family planning as well, so please make sure that you take a look at that. But if there's no other questions, we can get a round of applause for Ann Spencer. Thank you so much for all of that information. It's so helpful, and it's such a personal decision, so I appreciate your care with this conversation. So thank you all.